Okie dokie. So let's actually finish. Let's do our thing and finish up with the readings that I gave you, and then we can move on to really the poetry that we'll be reading this term. So we were talking about, in different realms, this new emphasis on self-fashioning and self-writing. We saw it in Shakespeare. We see it really in a kind of vulgar way, not vulgar, but a way we're more familiar with, this kind of Machiavellian way in Holbein. And now the last context that I wanted to raise up with you, and this is another way we see the end of a more God-centered Christian world and very much the beginnings of a humanist world, that re-emphasis on the human. The re-emphasis on the human meant the rediscovery of classical texts. I think we spoke briefly about this period being an age of discovery, an age of print, an age of discovery. Those things came together. One of the most famous poets in Europe, Petrarch, was busy much of the time uncovering or finding in various churches, finding copies of the classics and translating them. I think we also mentioned a certain kind of irony that the church, even though it had or had values that were opposed to the new humanist enterprise, they were the scribes who sat and preserved the texts. Remember, preservation of texts is not simple. Think about how many times you've lost stuff on your hard drive. Hopefully you don't do that anymore because we have now the cloud, right? But there's so many obsolete ways of accessing information, floppy disks, the smaller disk drives, 8-track players. I don't know who uses tape recorders anymore. So things become inaccessible because we don't no longer have the media to access them. So Greek and Latin texts had to be rediscovered. I mean, they didn't search for them on Google, right? They had to be found, rediscovered, disseminated, meaning translated, and then disseminated means given out, right? Now, of all the assignments that I gave you, this is probably the most difficult and the least easy to read. So we'll just focus on one paragraph. As I said, we're focusing on the human and also on translation. So he says he was like the major educator in his time. He was licensed by Queen Elizabeth, I think. He was the teacher of many of the major poets of the period. Him and a fellow we'll look at in just a second named Richard Mulcaster. And in fact, since we're talking about translation, let's take a look at that first. Here it is, Richard Mulcaster, okay. I think 1580, I think. And here he's really, the reason I'm looking at this now first is because he's thinking about translation in general. And what I'd like you to start to think about is translation is not only translation of words, it can be a translation of culture. And really what we see in the history of the West is the continual translation, really, of the Greeks and the Hebrews into different languages. So there's a translation of the Romans translate the Greek into Roman. Remember, we read the Aeneid. Dante translates the epic tradition, the Greek tradition, into something very Christian. Milton will do the same thing. He's the kind of the point. Milton's Paradise Lost, and I'll say this now, Milton is certainly not as great as Shakespeare, but because nobody is, but he is just the most powerful voice in the English tradition. And he's the poet, as he was called during his age, a poet of liberty, of freedom. So we're kind of, that's kind of the end point that we're aiming towards. That's the beginnings of the English tradition, which start with the people we're reading now and go all the way up to Milton. Milton writes Paradise Lost. It's most interesting because it's like a translation of everything. He takes everything that came before him and translate it into his particular view of Christianity, which is also happens to be, as we talk again and again, universal, not in the sense that we are all universal Christians, but there are ways of learning things from people we don't agree with. I feel like I have to say that because it's so much in doubt these days. So Mulcaster says, on translation, is it not indeed a marvelous bondage to become servants to one tongue for learning's sake, the most of our time? What would that language be, the language of learning? Good, Latin, with loss of most time, whereas we may have the very same treasure in our own tongue with the gain of more time, meaning we can have the same treasures and we can live more efficiently. That seems to be what he's saying here, right? The same treasures are available, which is in 1580, as I've been trying to impart to you, it was a chutzpah to say that because they didn't really have anything to show for themselves. So let's go back. So we're going to gain more time. Our own language bearing the joyful title of our liberty and freedom. So here again, the definition, self-definition of the English nation. You mentioned Milton as the poet of liberty here in 1580, and this is 70 years before Milton will write Paradise Lost. The English language is associated with liberty and freedom. That is, we are making ourselves with this new language. And now, this is a very clear sense, and clear in the sense that it allows for ambiguity, of the relationship between English culture, the Renaissance English culture, and precedent classical culture. So we'll read it together. I love Rome, but London better. I favor Italy, but England more. I honor Latin. I worship the English. Very, very strong, right? Now, with all that said, Mulcaster is showing his allegiance to Rome and Italy, Italy being, right, we should be aware, and we said this earlier, that the Renaissance spread up. I mean, you know this from TV shows, right? That the Renaissance happens first in Southern Europe. So English, and this interesting question, how much were English people aware of stuff being published in Italy? I would say probably a lot. So there was a lot, there was already, Italy had already established itself in Europe as continuous with Greek, Latin, and Greek and Latin traditions through their literature. Listen, they had Dante, right? So it's a great start. But so he says, I favor Italy, but England more. I honor Latin. I worship the English. So on the one hand, I think we see a real confidence, and perhaps that really is to be emphasized, a real confidence in the English nation. On the other hand, I don't know. I'm wondering, is there a kind of cultural anxiety being expressed here by Mulcaster? And what I mean to say by that is Mulcaster, do we see his uncertainty about the enterprise here? Because, and it is complicated, because the English, though being original, and we really have that sense here, what they are going to do is to imitate classical forms, right? And try to compete with classical cultures, not just, I mean, also the sonnet, and that's coming from Italy, right? So Petrarch and Dante. And the story of the sonnet during our period is very interesting, because that becomes the main genre, but others will write plays, of course, comedies and tragedies, and then epics as well. And Milton, who is the apotheosis of the tradition, meaning everything, apotheosis is everything else leads to that. Milton brings both the classical and Reformation traditions together, very much, as I was saying earlier, as a poet of liberty. So Mulcaster here, I mean, even Milton, remembering now what I was going to say, even Milton, like he's anxious about the Greeks, he's anxious about the Hebrews, but he also eats them at the same time. So that's what I kind of meant about cultural anxiety. And I think there is that sense, especially in the early Renaissance, can we actually do this? They were great enough to realize the greatness of the Greek and Latin traditions, but they didn't know if they could do it themselves. And it turns out remarkably, and it's an extraordinary moment, not only in English history, but in world history, they do it. And I think, just to pull out just for a second, all reading in a way is a form of translation. That maybe bears a little bit more explanation. How can all reading be a form of translation? Meaning, if you're translating it, I would say maybe, then you're taking it out of one language and putting it in your language. And it's true. And translators, they have two criteria. One is to get the meaning right, and the other is it for it to be accessible. So there's a movement for the translator towards the thing to get it right, but to make it accessible away from the thing. A good translation, a good modern translation, will be that one that resonates with the language of today, and bringing out the meanings of the past. Meaning there's always a kind of reciprocal relationship between present and past. The present brings out something in the past. If we want to discuss this more, it really is a whole kind of philosophical conversation. When is a badly played Beethoven symphony not considered a Beethoven symphony? When is, like, if you have there was a controversy recently about Gal Gadot playing Cleopatra because a Jew playing an Egyptian was not okay. At what point do you say that a certain kind of production of Shakespeare, like a 21st century production of Hamlet, at what point does it stop being Hamlet? Meaning, at what point does it become something entirely different? The really great translations, the really great productions of Shakespeare, they can be the most modern because they and possibly are, because if we resonate with the contemporary. And sometimes productions that take a lot of risks, they bring out something in Shakespeare that other plays don't. Translations as well. So translation here from Mulcaster is both the exertion of English independence, but also the whole project depends on Italy, Latin, Rome, and Greece. Now, translation, as we were saying, is not just something that Mulcaster abstractly talked about. It was part of the curriculum. This is really the only part I wanted you to read of this. And it's a curriculum for 12-year-old kids who were, I don't know what their level of literacy was, certainly higher than our 12-year-olds. This sounds fairly traumatizing to me, but people were different maybe. So we'll read the exercise here. So in these few lines, I have wrapped up the most tedious part of grammar and also the ground of almost all the rules that are so busily taught by the master. So he's writing a book called The Schoolmaster, and so hardly learned by the scholar. In all common schools, which after this sort the master shall teach without error, and the scholar shall learn without great pain. The master being led by so sure a guide, and the scholar being born to so plain and easy a way. He's talking about, like, I guess the schoolmaster. He's got to be in touch with smart people. He has to be in touch with professors or whatever, right? Because he needs the master. I wonder if he's getting that from Aristotle, the master worker. Remember that in the Poetics? The master is actually doing it, but he needs somebody to help him. And therefore, we do not condemn rules, but we gladly teach rules and teach them more plainly, sensibly, and orderly than they be commonly taught in common schools. You see, he's in the middle of a fight, obviously, right? Now, here is the exercise now for these kids. For when the master shall compare Tully's book with his scholar's translation, let the master at the first lead and teach his scholar
to join the rules of his grammar book with the examples of his present lesson. I guess again, so there is a kind of dialogue between the scholar and the master. Let's see. That was oddly not the passage I wanted to read, but interesting nonetheless. Here it is. Here it is. Pedagogy, Renaissance sadism as pedagogy. First, let him teach the child cheerfully and plainly. Right, there's also this idea of the plainness of English against the ornateness of language, of Latin. English was going to do something better. It was going to free people from that old way of thinking. And the old way of thinking is in Latin and in complicated terms. So let him construe it in English, so off the child may easily carry away the understanding of it. Lastly, and you see this is generational, we're teaching for the next generation. Lastly, parse it over perfectly. I don't want to scroll all the way down. This done thus, let the child by and by both construe it, parse it over again, so that it may appear the child doubteth in nothing that his master taught him before. I think parsing is when you parse a sentence, you're breaking down the sentence into nouns and verbs and adjectives. I think that must be what's happening here as well. After this, and here's the really fun part, the child must take a paper book, a choveret, blue one, and sitting in some place where no man shall prompt him by himself. It's like you hear, it's like, this is a tough guy, right? Let him translate into English his former lesson. Oh, so they're learning Cicero. We never learned Cicero together, but Cicero was a great orator. That was one of the things that the Romans actually surpassed the Greeks in. That is, in this art of speaking and oration, and the greatest of them, Ascham refers to him earlier as Tully. He's better known now as Cicero. He's great deliverer of speeches, writer of speeches. And he was really thought at his time, and also in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, to represent a certain kind of perfection of style. Cicero, actually once knew Latin, builds his sentences, and you can kind of see them as aesthetic objects by seeing all the parts in relationship to them. So it's important just to know that. Here we go. After this, we're going back to the beginning. The child must take a paper book, and sitting in some place where no man shall prompt him by himself, let him translate into English his former lesson, Cicero into English. Then, showing it to his master, let the master take from his Latin book, let the master take from him his Latin book, and pausing an hour at least, hafsaka, then let the child translate his own English into Latin, again in another paper book. Did they do this in your schools? No. When the child bringeth it turned into Latin, the master must compare it with Tully's, that is Cicero, it's Tully's book, and lay them together. And where the child doth well, either in choosing or placing of Tully's word, let the master praise him and say, here, you do well. That's the carrot, right? The encouragement. For you, I assure you, there is no such whetstone to sharpen a good wit and encourage will to learning as is praise, and also scaring the hell out of people, right? Anyway, I'm being really sarcastic about this, but I think they did do it, and the kids did know how to do it. But for us, it's the ideal behind this exercise, which is really the most interesting. That let's think about it. Let's go through it again ourselves. So the kid has a lesson in Cicero. He translates the Cicero, right, into his own English. And then they take a break, which is essential. Really, it's like a cognitive breathing space. And the kid comes back and translates back into Latin. And he's praised. And here you see a kind of different relationship to the past than Mulcaster's, because here Ascham seems a little bit more conservative, because Cicero becomes like everything. Get it like Cicero, be like Cicero. But even with that, we notice that the exercise, it enacts a kind of back and forth of cultural conversation, getting from Latin into English. So here we took the Mulcaster's more general sense of translation translation from one culture to another, Mulcaster's confidence, here we see a version of that, even though they have different perspectives. What's important for us is to see very much the Renaissance is as this process of translating the past into the present. And that, again, takes a lot of courage, because you have to go back to cultures that they themselves were superior during their time, and you're in competition with them. So it's not such an easy thing to do. So Ascham is like, just get them right. Mulcaster's more, let's go into the future. One more thing to end our discussion, by looking now at possible images for my lecture on the Iliad. Now I want to look at a painting. I think we looked at it briefly, did we? I get confused sometimes. The Ambassadors by Holbein. Go to the National Gallery, which I highly recommend. There's some, you go to the National Gallery, and really, before you go to a museum like that, you have to kind of find out what they have, because you only have so much energy for looking, right? And you want to make sure that you look at the really cool things, right? So this is one of the things you look at, and what's amazing about it. In fact, I had been teaching it for many, many years, and I'm saying, okay, here, bye. And I finally said, I finally saw it, and it was just much, much bigger than I had thought it was. Now here we have practice reading. We have, on the one hand, the courtier on the left, the clergyman on the right. You can tell from his collar, you can tell from the modesty of his clothing. There are all sorts of things to read in this painting. There is an open book, right? There is a musical instrument. The musical instrument, as somebody pointed out to me, did we look at this together, or did I show it to somebody else? We're kind of embarrassed if we looked at it together already. If we did, forgive me. There is a broken string here. So, which is interesting, right? So we see different representations of the musical arts, of the mechanisms used to measure the world. Even if we did talk about it, we're talking more now. Now, why would that be important? I mean, I don't know what some of the stuff is on the top. It looks like certain kinds of more practical, mechanical, physical devices are on the top, and on the bottom we have like the humanities, right? Music. It looks like that's some kind of book. There's another open book here. I don't know what this is. Here we have these devices used to measure the world. And I think we see in these two characters a certain kind of confidence and stability, and also solidness. And this is an image of English humanists. Interesting, right? You see, there's at least in Holbein's representation, there's this enormous sense of self-possession and confidence. You don't see pictures like this in the Middle Ages. You see people, you see figures of biblical stories, you see people in church. Really, portraiture starts during our period, where we focus on the human face, and that's happening mostly in Northern Europe. So this guy has the accoutrements of learning, that is the dress of learning. And he's also accompanied by a priest, who is also part of this humanist enterprise. The broken guitar string here, I think, is maybe showing a certain kind of imperfection, that even though they have mastery, in some ways they don't have mastery. And maybe we did look at this part, right, which is the most famous part of the painting, that if you look from the very side, you're seeing what was called a memento mori. Let's just do a ambassador's close up. There's probably a ton of reference, like videos and stuff about this, like identifying all the stuff. And especially, well, look at, I mean, you just see the detail is music, as we saw, right? We don't know what this is. And here is what we see. Where is this in the painting? Oh, wow, look at this one, right? Let's accept all cookies, shall we? The giant one, right? So, so where is that? Where was that skull in the painting? Let's see. Well, the skull in the painting is here. And if you look at the side, you look from the side, you see it. So I guess it's so kind of typically Renaissance because it accommodates two things at the same time that seem so opposed to each other. There, on the one hand, is that sense of human confidence, the composure, the mastery, all, especially these devices for measurement. We measure the world. We have globes because we know the world. We're bigger than the world. I remember the idea of the Copernican model with Earth at the center and round is relatively new. But here we have people who know that, obviously everyone knows that, but also claim a certain knowledge and mastery of it. You've all heard of the expression, knowledge is power. So you see that very, very clearly on display here. In a way, it's a nice way to conclude like this part of the introduction where we've seen emphasis pretty much across the board in different ways on the individual. And here we get this image of the individual. And yet, we have to take into account this skull on the bottom. And I guess part of the question is, what does Holbein think these humanists are missing? What are they not seeing? Let's just go back to this. Right. So what are they not seeing? So in their confidence, it looks like, I don't know who's being reminded. The skull is a memento mori. Memento mori, M-O-R-I, a remembrance of death. So maybe it's Holbein's commentary on these humanists. Don't get too arrogant. And that's one of the weird things about our period. And again, what makes the literature so interesting is because you have these two opposite things coming together. And they come together somehow, right? Okay, beautiful painting, right? You really see the greens and the reds, all the details. Okay, can we do a little review now of what we did today? So you've watched now 2 videos. The first one, we discussed the creation of English identity, or we transitioned from that into a discussion of more personal identity with Holbein's kind of Machiavellian conception of self-development. And now we switched really to an educational realm, which was very, 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 very important. Obviously, these kinds of translation exercises, becoming familiar with these texts foreign to the culture of which you were part of, meaning it's not the church, it's something else. So these things are becoming disseminated. And we see the emphasis on teaching these kids how to translate from one language into another. So translation being very important. And also here, we see this emphasis. This is the real deal. This is these guys don't have to read Hobie, right? They're already there. And even with that, there's Holbein's little casting of doubt. Like, no matter how great human mastery is, and really, we take it for granted because we live in a technological society, but there is an enormous sense of a kind of evolution of the human. I mean, it's a metaphor, obviously, but that's how they saw themselves, as surpassing the closed-mindedness of the past. Remember when Mulcaster talks about, Latin wasting our time? So these guys are getting on with it. And in a way, that's what the Renaissance is. It's saying, yeah, we know your stuff, we love your stuff, and we're going to get on with it. And part of the interesting part of our story is the act of translation is very much part of that getting on with it, finding a way to bring the past into the present. The Renaissance is such a great model again, and we're in such a good position, most of us, to understand this, because we have a sense of the Greek and Latin tradition. We know what they're confronting. And remember, they're coming out of what had been a completely Christian culture dominated by the church. It's still a Christian culture, but it's a culture that is exploring the human. We mentioned last time that there is a problem with, in our period, we have people who make poems who are very much in the classical tradition of making images, and yet their religious commitments turn them into breakers of images. So there's a similar kind of conflict here. The conflict, I lost track of my thought, and you can rewind and tell me sometime in the future, but let's just go on and sum up. So there's also this idea of translating, going back into the past to make the present and to write themselves, the power that gives them. Knowledge is power, but nonetheless, we see even Holbein is reminding people, you may be humanists, don't forget that you are human. So with that, we'll end for today. Any questions? Terrific, let me know. Please. Right, so we're going to start to read poetry together. And these assignments were really hard, I think, because they were, even though they're all literary in their way, by which I mean you can read them and learn things from them, that the style requires a certain kind, you have to show up to read it. But it's not the great works of English literature. But when we start next week, we're going to be starting to read, I think we'll start with Ben Jonson's To Penshurst. I'll write you about this. But you have to figure out a way of understanding the poem. It's not a long poem. It's like 180 lines. And so that means probably finding something online with notes, or going to the library and getting notes. And it means reading the Norton Anthology introduction, right? Part of the difference between, let's say, this and a course on the novel, where you're reading a novel a week, is that for us, the attention is definitely on the work. But in order to understand the work, we have to do more work. So that's kind of what gets added in. So you read the Norton introduction to Penshurst. And that will like get you situated. So you have some idea, like, what the hell is this? Because as we said before, the writers of the Renaissance are writing in the genres of the classics. There's one genre that I think maybe goes back to Rome. It's called the country house poem, a poem about a house, which is weird, right, from our perspective. Johnson's To Penshurst is a poem about, Johnson's To Penshurst is a poem about the house of his patron. So obviously, if we're reading this, a house is not just a house. And what we'll think about is what does Johnson represent in representing the house? What beyond the house? And also, and this is good to go back to our Shakespeare from earlier today, what is the relationship between the writer and the patron, or the writer and the public? We have to talk a little bit more about ways in which part of the problem during our period is people didn't know for sure if they had an audience for what they were writing. Meaning you got these scholar guys and they're desperate for an audience, and they're afraid that English people are just too whatever to get it, too vulgar. We'll read more about this. Johnson is very interested in kind of creating a community, mostly of rich people who will give him money. And you'll see that he's playing with that relationship in the poem to Penshurst, in which he addresses Robert Sidney, talks about his wife, other things as well. It's a good way of kind of moving into the more literary, and also you'll see as you read it, summing up some of the things that we've discussed up until this point. I hope we get to see each other next week.